Hello everyone and welcome to this new video. I'm Zuka and today we will meet Monk from Frost Giant. How are you, Monk?
I'm great. Can't wait to talk to both you and the French community and the English speaking community because we're doing this interview in English about Stormgate, the newest RTS from Frost Giant.
Yes. Can you introduce yourself a little bit? What is your work at Frost Giant and your work on Stormgate?
Yeah, sure. At Frost Giant and on Stormgate in particular, I am the lead co-op designer, and right now I'm focusing a lot on the moment-to-moment gameplay of what Stormgate is going to be about. Previous to working at Frost Giant, I worked at Blizzard on StarCraft 2 as also the lead co-op designer and on Balance as well. And prior to that, I worked for a little-known esports organization called Team Liquid back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah, we know what is Team Liquid. So you are focused on gameplay, and this interview will be focused on the gameplay of Stormgate. So I will ask a lot of questions. Some questions will be a little bit touchy. So yeah, some questions are I think never been asked in previous interview. So let's start with the gameplay. So in terms of gameplay, what is your goal with Stormgate? Do you want to do fast RTS, slow RTS? So something more like StarCraft 2, more like Age of Empires 4, sorry, Age of Empires 4, or something else. What is your goal around
Yeah.
this point?
Yeah, I think when if the question is about pacing, I think there's a lot of factors that come into really the pacing of a game, whether there's a long or a short build-up time, or I think what a lot of people are asking when they ask about this is the time to kill of the units. With regards to time to kill, we're looking into something closer to that of somewhere between StarCraft 1 and Warcraft 3, rather than the very low time to kill of StarCraft 2. We believe that in StarCraft 2, um, uh, unit deaths can be potentially a little too punishing,
Yeah.
in that if you aren't paying attention to your first three Marines, for example, you lose them and you kind of just lost the game. What we hope to achieve in Stormgate is maybe if you're not paying attention to your first three Marines and an enemy is hitting them for like a few seconds, they're not dead, but rather they're at maybe half health, and in that way you can still like micro the Marines back and still not lose the game immediately.
Yes, and there is always an option to heal units for each factions or not.
Yeah, so we still don't have still aren't ready to announce exact
Yeah.
mechanics yet. But I think it's cool that different factions have different abilities to heal their units. Like for example, Zergs auto regenerate, Terrans have medics or repair, and Protoss, even though they have shield batteries, the generally, unless you're in a team game, the health of the Protoss units is not healable basically. I think this is cool both from an asymmetry perspective and also from the perspective of the ability to help each other in team games. Because if everyone has healing, then no one is able to differentiate themselves. But if one player has healing and the other player does not have healing, then the sum of the parts can be greater than, or the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Perfect answer. So on your website, you talked a bit about adding new units, and how do you see that? Will it be on a regular basis or more like extensions like Wings of Liberty, Light of the Swarm, Legacy of the Void? Do you want to do it like monthly, weekly? Weekly, I don't think, but monthly, something like this. How do you see that?
Yeah, so we don't have a content cadence to announce right now, and I suspect even if I told you what we thought our content cadence would be, it will drastically change based on the capabilities of the studio.
Yeah.
But one thing we're really modeling off of is the one of the most popular games of the last few years called Path of Exile, in which what the Path of Exile team has found is that to be successful, it's really important to be consistent. they learned a lot from one of the Hearthstone streamers or one of the Path of Exile streamers, Kripparrian, and Kripparrian basically gave them the advice that oh, the reason that my viewers can keep coming back to me is because they know I stream at a consistent time every day. Even though maybe this one of my viewers goes on vacation for a month and he doesn't have access to internet. When he comes back a month later, he still knows I stream at, let's say, 6 p.m. or 6 a.m. every single day. He knows to come back. So our goal here is to have our free to play content releases, or DLC as it were, um, to be very consistent in cadence. So if you know, for example, our content will release every 3 months or every 6 months, for instance, and you're able to come back to that.
Yes.
So to answer your questions, probably somewhere in the multiple times a year range rather than every 2 years range.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. And so let's go to the topic of balance. How do you think that the game will be balanced? So from the top, or more casual oriented. So how do you see the balance?
Yeah, so our approach with balance, and our philosophy around balance is that a balance designer is really a subset of a game designer, right?
Yeah.
And the a game designer, I think one of his or her main goals is to maximize the fun of the game. So a balance designer is trying to achieve that goal using the tools that they have, right? Um, and what really determines the fun of the game, well, a large part of what determines the fun of the game how is the perception of balance. And I feel like that's kind of the crux of what I'm getting at. That is that our goal is to maximize the perception of balance rather than the balance itself. So I'll give you a few examples.
Yes.
Uh, Yeah, so I think like just for an average player, if you lose and you perceive that your race is favored, you have or your race is unfavored, you
Yes.
are often quick to blame the balance rather than blaming yourself, and I feel like that can lead to a lot of negative feelings there. Another example is, let's say you have this Terran versus Protoss matchup, right?
Yes. For example.
Where
Yeah.
Yeah, for example, a Terran versus Protoss matchup, where the win rate is 50-50, for example, right? But you have a situation where Terran might often feel that they cannot win in late game. So this is a scenario where statistically the game is imbalanced, but Terrans have this feeling of, oh, I'm on a timer. I have to win now. I have to win now. I have to win now. And that like constant struggle, that feeling, I think is not positive for a lot of players. So this is a situation where even though the statistics are balanced, the fun is not necessarily maximized. So back to your original question, do we balance at a top level or a casual oriented level? I think when it comes to perception of balance, which is what we're trying to
Yeah.
maximize, I think the perception comes from basically top level balance, right? Um, who is doing well at the top, and it kind of trickles down from there. That being said, we are still concerned, or we still pay attention to quote unquote the more casual audience. And I'll give you some examples from StarCraft's history there. The first example is in Legacy of the Void, High Templars gain an auto attack. And this was directly due to data
Yeah.
that suggested that at the very lowest levels, Protoss was actually really struggling. It was the worst race. So at the high level, Protoss players are able to control their High Templar. They're able to not A move them into their opponent's army. But at the lower levels, you have a lot of F2 A move, in which adding an attack to the High Templar greatly helped with. So this is an example of a situation where I think we make changes that don't really affect the pro level at all. I mean, like this like really tiny
Yeah. I
High
see. I
Templar
see.
attack is not going to not going to affect the outcome of games, but I think it drastically helps the lower level players. Another example that I like to give is the Widowmine drop. The Widowmine drop, uh, at the very highest level, I think it was very defendable.
Mm.
Um, you didn't really have games where you actually did have like some
Yeah.
really
It happens. It
silly
happens.
looking
Yeah.
games, even at the pro level, where like the first Widowmine drop kills the entire probe line and the game is automatically over. But for the most part, this was, I would call, relatively like balanced from a statistical standpoint. The problem is that at the like, kind of like the mid-tier levels, I would say like the diamond / mid masters levels or even high masters levels, the execution level required to execute the Widow Mine drop was much greater than the execution required to defend it. And when you have this execution, when you have this like mismatch of how easy it is to do these strategies, I think that is when there's a problem. So what the team did at that point there was they removed the ability for the Widow Mine to be cloaked after it shot its payload.
Mm.
And that was another example of a situation where, yes, 99% of balance changes will be towards the highest level, towards making sure the perception around balance stays high. But some of the changes are focused more around the not necessarily the highest level, but to also ensure that the game is as fun as possible. So long story short, we are balancing for fun rather than statistics.
Okay. Okay. Perfect answer. um, so let's go a little bit to the faction. Let's talk a bit about factions. So right now we know that there is 2 factions. And can you a little bit describe them? And do they have an orientation? So maybe something more like Zerg, something more like Terran. Do they have an orientation right now?
Yeah, so currently we've announced 2 factions. First is the Human Resistance. This is a faction. They're very human-like. They exist on an alternate Earth in the future, in the near future. They've survived past an apocalypse level event. However, at the time of when the story begins, they're kind of recovering from that event. They're doing pretty fine. They're very hopeful. So kind of the setting is kind of like a post-apocalyptic hopeful one. But then something happens. Then a Stormgate opens, and the Infernal Hosts come in. The Infernal Hosts are a race of, well, we'll find out more about them in the story, but they are. They're not necessarily demons, but they look very much so like demons. In fact, the Infernal Foes have existed for quite a while, and they are kind of what inspired a lot of like religious imagery around what we know as demons in various cultures. And now they're back for some reason somehow. And a lot of the beginnings of our story kind of explore the history of the apocalypse and the history of the Stormgate and the Infernals. In terms of the orientation of these factions, I don't have anything to announce right now, and I can't say too much right now.
Yeah.
But I'm looking forward to sharing that in a later update. I also can't say too much about. Yes, I am able to say we're going to add additional faction or factions, but I can't say too much about that right now
You
either.
can say how much, and you can say. I have just another question about this. So about the human faction, human resistance, we saw that there is something more like marines and something more like mech units. Does it mean that there is 2 different style of human resistance, or it's the same faction? It's unit from the same faction. Maybe you can tell it, but
Yeah, that they are intended to be units from the same faction there.
okay.
So it would be similar to that of like seeing a siege tank in a marine, for instance. One is maybe a bio unit, one is a mechanical
Yeah.
unit, but they do exist on the same faction.
Okay, great, perfect. So it was my second question about faction. How many faction will exist? But we will know it in some months, maybe, or some years. Okay, no problem. So do you want to do an asymmetric balance for factions? And how deep will it be? Deep like in StarCraft 2, deep like in Age of Empires 4, which is a little bit asymmetric, but not so much.
Yeah. So one of our core gameplay philosophies is that we are first and foremost inspired by Blizzard RTS. Um, so in Blizzard RTS, what we're especially taking from is the level of asymmetry that unit asymmetry that exists in StarCraft 1 and 2, the StarCraft franchise in general. We feel like there's basically no other game that matches that level of asymmetry and does it in a digestible way. I could imagine a game where it goes a little further, but I think if you go too far, you have a risk for kind of degenerate behavior among the different factions. So that's the level of unit asymmetry we're looking for. In terms of worker and mining asymmetry, we are looking closer to that of Warcraft 3, where all the different workers are able to mine in slightly different ways. And in doing so, we feel like we are able to more diversify how harassment works in our game. In the StarCraft franchise, you have harassment almost like 95% focused on workers.
Mm,
There's less about like hitting buildings, for instance, except for a short timing when you can kill a tech lab on
mm,
a barracks, for
yes.
example. But in Warcraft 3, you have a lot more vulnerabilities. Different workers are vulnerable to different extents, and also different buildings are vulnerable to different extents. There's also the factor of the harassment sometimes comes from the form of putting pressure on the buildings so that the workers are pulled off, and therefore A, not mining, and B, expending resources to repair those structures. We think it's very interesting for this nuance of harassment to come about, and especially in an asymmetrical way.
Okay. Okay, perfect. On the yeah, on the economic side, so you already answered a little bit to this question. The game will be closer to StarCraft 2 or Warcraft 3, and how do you place the supply cap? So it's something like Warcraft 3 or something like StarCraft 2 with a low amount of unit or a high amount of unit.
So the first question was about buildings, right?
Yes.
So in terms of buildings, we want base building to be really important, to be really impactful, but not in a binary way. So we're going to lessen the impact of base building in some ways and increase the impact of base building in other ways. Let me explain. So we're gonna lessen the impact of base building at the very beginnings of the game,
Mm,
and what we mean specifically by that is we don't necessarily want players to be forced to know that I have to wall off at my main. We
okay.
don't want players to specifically know I have to make a forge in very specific positions in my natural as a Protoss player, and I need to put a zealot in the
The
in
wall.
in that
Mm,
wall. I think the level of knowledge required to get there, and especially to get there for every single map, is really a high barrier to entry for a lot of players. Um, so in that way, we want to make that building placement less impactful and um, less determine the outcome of the game. However, in general, we want to increase the impact of base building. We want to make it so that where you place every building matters more, especially relative to StarCraft. I think Warcraft maybe does a bit better job at this, because uh, you have different buildings that provide different bonuses
mm,
and different buildings that have different levels of vulnerability. Specifically, what we're inspired by is actually a single player RTS game called They Are Billions. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's basically like you're building the whole game is a lot about like building your base, and defending against hordes of zombies. And in that game, where you place each individual building matters a lot. And specifically, there are synergies when you place building A next to building B, for instance.
Okay,
So,
okay. I
so
see what you mean. Okay,
yeah, so there's a lot of thought that goes into like exactly where I place everything.
okay. So
You also asked, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no. Sorry, you can you can continue. Sorry.
Yeah, and then your second question about supply, where we want to end up, or where we're thinking of ending up right now, is that the supplies are closer to 200 supply in StarCraft. But with the caveat that we want to make it so that our different factions will have the ability to push the boundaries of army sizes. So we want to be able to, for instance, out Zerg the Zerg with some factions, and also have smaller armies than the Protoss in other factions. So a greater diversity of how large your army can be at max supply.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Um, um, so you already talked a bit about base building, um, and so I have another questions about gameplay. Will Stormgate be more micro oriented or more macro oriented? From what I understand, it will be more micro oriented because unit will live longer. So yeah, can you answer to this question?
So I think a game can be both macro oriented and micro oriented. So in terms of macro oriented, I think where we're aiming for Stormgate, and one of the key, I would say almost the number one gameplay pillar of Stormgate is highlighting the importance of territory control. With regards to territory control, I think it's really cool that by expanding territory, you're able to gain, for example, additional resources, additional benefits. But at the same time, you're putting yourself at risk to being attacked from multiple angles, from additional angles. And I think that is kind of really core to what RTS is really about. So in that way, we really want to promote a macro-oriented gameplay in which you're constantly expanding and you're constantly able to gain more territory and defend that territory. From the micro's perspective, I think it's a little it's a little nebulous as to say like what micro-oriented means. But I think when most people think micro-oriented, they think of longer battles as a la Warcraft 3, right? That's not to say StarCraft 2 and StarCraft 1 don't have micro. It's just that the opportunities to micro within a specific battle are longer. So our aim for Stormgate is to be um, more more micro oriented. If you take that definition, we want the ability to micro in a battle to be higher. So in a way, it's like both, but I would say in terms of the overall micro versus macro playstyle, imagine either Warcraft 3 with the ability to expand much
Hmm?
greater, or StarCraft 2 where the units have don't die as quickly. They have higher health pools, for example. So that's kind of what we're shooting for.
Okay. So this question is really important for me. Do you want to make the cheesy playstyle viable?
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's different extents to how impactful cheese can be. Um, so uh, so with respect to StarCraft One or StarCraft in general, we want to make it so that there are fewer game-ending moments because you didn't scout something, for
Hmm.
instance. So we want to lessen the impact of early game deaths, and so, for example, um, we take a lot of inspiration from Warcraft 3. In Warcraft 3, actually, let's talk about StarCraft. I think StarCraft is one of the only RTSs where there's not kind of an innate building defense or an innate base defense, rather. You just start off with your workers, and you don't really have any defender's advantage aside from your ramp. So, in a previous question, I already talked about we don't want to force players to know you have to wall off in a specific way in the beginning of the game. So, and how do we accomplish that? We do that by giving you some very weak early game defenses in the early on that won't prevent you from prevent like harassment in a meaningful way, but at the same time will still generally cushion you from deaths, except from the most like all-in playstyles. Um, we take a lot of inspiration from Warcraft 3, in that they have very weak burrows, they have very weak moon wells that can still give you a strong defender's advantage in the early game. But it's only one burrow, it's only one moon well, and that will help cushion players from dying in the very early stages.
With regards to other types of cheeses, we don't want necessarily game-ending damage. So one strategy that we're taking there is um, our strategy with cloak, or our thinking about cloaking, is going to be closer to how it works in Warcraft 3, where if you break cloaking,
Yes.
if you attack while cloaking, you break the cloak and you're revealed there. Back to the base defenses, I think there's a spectrum to how strong the base defenses are. And again, we're thinking closer to that of Warcraft 3. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's kind of the company of heroes mentality, where in the early game you are absolutely invulnerable from attacks completely, right? You basically your main base is invulnerable, and uh, you're encouraged to basically not engage with either each other's mains at all.
Okay. Will the game have an air playstyle?
Yeah, we'll definitely have air units in our game. However, relative to StarCraft 2, we're going to have them be a little less impactful in two ways. Number one, I feel like just overall, air units in StarCraft 2 are a little too powerful. They're a little overstated based on
Yes.
how much they cost. And specifically, we think that another one of our key tenets, gameplay tenets, is the importance of terrain, and that kind of relates to territory control. And what both these things mean is, like, we really think that ground units versus ground units is really interesting, because they are able to traverse terrain, and they're both limited in terrain. So there's a lot of cool positioning battles. We think ground versus air is really interesting, because what often ends up happening is you have a stronger ground force that is less mobile and has to conform to terrain, versus an air force that is kind of free to run around. But the third option, air versus air, is less interesting,
Yeah.
because neither you just kind of have often two armies slamming into each other, and there's very little maneuvering that you can do, or at least less maneuvering than you can do with compared to the other two options. So in our game, we really are going to try to promote more ground versus ground options, and also ground versus air battles. The second thing I want to talk about is we also, because our focus is on the importance of terrain, and the importance, another tenet we have is the importance of defender's advantage. We want to make it so that it becomes less trivial to subvert that terrain. So two examples here are the warp prism and the medevac. Um, the warp prism allows you to really subvert defender's advantage, to warp in a ton of units into your opponent's base, and
Yes.
that's something, like, yes, it might be cool later on in the game, when tech level gets high, but the warp prism is kind of like a tier 2 type unit, and we feel like it is able to subvert that terrain much too quickly. Um, and with regards to medevacs is an example where we feel like the opportunity cost to make a medevac should be a little higher. To make a transport specifically should be a little higher. The medevac, why would you ever not build a medevac, right? Like,
Yes.
especially if you're going bio, like, you, even if the medevac could not transport units, you would still build the medevac,
Yeah.
because just to do the healing. But because the medevac is so omnipresent, and it's so easy to get, it the defender's advantage and the terrain of, like, your main base defender's advantage can be ignored, I think, a little too quickly in over the course of the game. We wanted to make it so that, yes, you can still subvert terrain eventually, but the pace at which you are able to subvert that terrain is a much slower pace, and the battles open up, uh, maybe, let's say, uh, like 15 minutes into the game, or maybe you can still drop at like 5 minutes or 6 minutes of the game, but it's a much bigger commitment.
Okay. Um, so an important questions many viewers ask it. Will the game have a play style based on heroes, so hero unit, and if yes, will it be similar to Warcraft 3, or do you explore another way to use them?
Yeah, so as a precursor, and this is a precursor to every question I've answered today, we're still relatively early.
We still got some ways to go, and everything that we're saying right now is what we're currently working with, and not
Yes.
necessarily going to be in the final product or even in the beta product. So that being said, what we're currently at is we are experimenting with heroes in all our game modes. That includes campaign, PvE, co-op content, the 1v1 mode, and the 3v3 mode, which are going to be two completely separate competitive modes.
Yes.
So where we are now is we're experimenting with them in all modes, and what they look like now, what heroes look like now, is that they're going to be more like unique units that don't level and don't accrue items. I think from a Blizzard RTS perspective, there is kind of a trap to fall into where you kind of think, oh, what is a hero? Is it no heroes in StarCraft, or is it heroes that level up and
Yeah,
have items
I
in
see.
Warcraft 3? And I think there's a very this is a spectrum, and I think there's a very wide spectrum of what a hero can be, right? So how we got there is we basically analyzed the benefits of heroes and the negatives of heroes. And the two main negatives we've found both just thinking about it internally and also going to the community and talking to engage with the community is the threat of over centralization and the threat of snowballing. There's often a problem in Warcraft 3 heroes where the heroes are so strong that everything is about the hero, and you have kind of these death balls that force players to kind of circle around the hero in order to be the most effective. So you have a lot less multi-prong play that you see in StarCraft. That's something we're trying to avoid. Rather, we're trying to encourage multi-prong armies, and we're trying to avoid the threat of deathballing. Another aspect is the threat of snowballing. In Warcraft 3, because of how leveling works, every kill that you kill of your opponent's army is permanently tracked on the hero. And that kind of creates somewhat of a snowball mechanic there. So how I describe heroes in our game is that we don't want them to be too strong, and but we want them to be we want them to have some unique impact on the battle. So another example from StarCraft, what we don't want to be is the Mothership Core specifically with the pylon overcharge. I think one problem with the
Yeah.
pylon overcharge was that it had the potential to do so much. As a 2 supply unit, it had the potential to fend off 40 supply of units, for example, right? And that isn't.
I played a lot with it, and I beat Clem on the ladder with this some year ago.
Yeah, it's so I guess where we want to be is lessons we learned from the Mothership Core are that we don't necessarily want our heroes to feel like they're over centralizing, and we don't want them to be lethal. We don't want them to feel like, oh, this hero unit or this like single unit soloed an entire army. So I guess from a StarCraft perspective, as I'm sure most of your audience is, the closest way I would describe heroes is a Mothership Core, but without the pylon overcharge ability, or maybe like imagine if you had like a Super Queen that didn't do a lot of damage, but you could only make one, and it had the spawn tumor, the inject, and the transfuse abilities. So in that situation, like I think a large part of why like queens are problematic in StarCraft 2 is because they weren't designed with the idea that you would have 8 of them in the early game, right? But if you had all those supportive abilities, all those macro mechanics onto a singular unit, I think that is much more digestible. A large part because you're going to have a lot stronger energy tension between the abilities of the Super Queen, rather than I would argue the lack of energy tension that is on 8 queens in the current StarCraft 2 metagame.
Okay, perfect. So, and I've just my opinion, but if you add some heroes, it can be a way to add a different play style to different faction. For example, you have a more defensive oriented, or more aggressive oriented, or something like this.
Yeah, totally. That's exactly our line of thinking as well.
Okay. So I played recently at Crossfire Legion, and I met something interesting that I almost never met on one versus one mode. It was event on the map. So, for example, a pack of resources that spawn on the map. For example, a pack of units that spawn on the map in a one versus one. Do you want to add things like this to encourage interaction?
Yeah, well, that's something that actually existed in StarCraft as well. It's called Fruitland. Do you remember that map?
In StarCraft 1?
It's StarCraft 2.
Yes, but not in one versus one mode.
There was a GSL map that had a big lemon on the map in the middle of the map. Remember, it was like fruit themed. There's a big lemon on the map,
I don't
and
remember.
this big lemon, every few minutes it spawned a small lemon, and if you mine the small lemon, you gain, I think it was like 500 minerals or something.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah,
I don't
it
remember.
was really funny. I think it was in GSTL only.
Okay.
But yeah, it wasn't played very often, and that mechanic actually wasn't engaged with very much. But it was really interesting thought experiment. So where we are there, I think first of all that is a really interesting idea, and it's actually something that we are experimenting with right now. Specifically, we're thinking about the idea of respawnable creep camps. Um, so our goals there are again we go back to our core gameplay tenets, and one of them is the importance of territory control. We want players to kind of jostle around the map for that territory, and whoever can control the territory can reap the benefits. And one way I think you can do this is with creep camps. These are kind of mini objectives that you point players to tell them, hey, you should pay attention here, and you should care about this point of territory. But thinking about it from the Warcraft 3 perspective, I think one problem that creep camps run into is um, after you clear the entire map of creeps, basically the map is devoid of interesting things
Yeah.
to do, interesting objectives, and you often have two players just kind of camping in their bases, doing nothing, not
Yeah.
interacting with each other. So I think if we add the inclusion of respawnable creeps, that kind of gives players consistently a reason to go here on the map or go there on the map or go here on the map. I think I think I think like just the genre of MOBAs is really interesting, and I think a lot of RTSs have taken a lot of lessons from MOBAs, but often I think they're taking I would say like they're taking like different lessons than I would take, right? They're like we don't necessarily have to have like heroes being the core part of an RTS, right? We don't necessarily have like to have leveling in an RTS, right? But the idea of respawnable creeps, which I believe was like first introduced in MOBAs, is something that
Yes.
we think is really interesting, and we think we can translate into an RTS as a unique mechanic.
Okay. And for you, what is the ideal length for a game and why?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we're planning on two separate unique game modes. The 1v1 core
Yes.
game mode and also the 3v3 kind of looser, more fun game mode that is going to be great for you to bring your friends into the game. And we're shooting for slightly different game lengths there. So for the 3v3 mode, let's start with that. We're aiming for somewhere around the 20-minute mark, and we're also aiming for that game mode to be very predictable in terms of how long the games will be. So they will, in our mind, center around 20 minutes, and they'll deviate slightly. Maybe they could end as early as like 12 or 15 minutes, for example. But they generally won't end earlier than that, and it could have a long tail. For example, they could theoretically go like it could still theoretically go like an hour, but
Yeah.
those are very, 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 very rare games, much more so than 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 StarCraft 2. I would say if we are to achieve our goals, games will end like maybe 90 or 80% of games will end within 5 minutes of 20 minutes. With regards to 1v1, our our ideal game length or the ideal average game length will be similar to that of the Blizzard RTSs of StarCraft and Warcraft, which is somewhere closer to the high teens, I would say. And with that, we are aiming for we are also aiming for more varied game lengths there. We don't want to necessarily uh, like box players into specific game lengths as much as we do in 3v3. However, that being said, we do want to slightly decrease the tail ends, the shortest games and the longest games. I already talked about maybe some innate base defenses that prevent you from outright ending the game. We still want players to be able to do like a lot of damage in the early games to each other, but we don't necessarily want the games to end outright. So I think by doing that, we allow we don't have as many games that end in the first 2 or 3 minutes, for example. We also are trying to make it so that the games don't last as long as maybe like 2 hours, for instance. So we're trying to shorten the tail ends of game lengths for the 1v1 mode, but still have something very similar to that of all Blizzard RTSs.
Um, I have really specific questions.
Sure.
Yeah. What is your feeling about free units? For example, Swarmhost or things like or units like this.
Yeah. So with regards to free units, actually, it's funny. Artosis asked me the same exact question in the pilot show yesterday. So I think when most people think of free units with regards to StarCraft 2, they think of the Broodlord, the Infestor, and the Swarmhost, right? And they often they group all 3 units up into the same category. But in my mind, these 3 units, I would agree, are somewhat problematic, but they are problematic for 3 different reasons, and
Yeah.
it's hard to like kind of encapsulate them as the problem is quote unquote free units. So with the Broodlord, I think the problem is that it has 2 problems. Number one, it is a very strong air to ground attacker, and as a very strong ground to air attacker, it kind of goes against the philosophy of Stormgate, where we want to encourage ground versus air battles.
Yes.
What the Broodlord does is it shuts down ground so hard that um, every race essentially. I guess Thors and Ghosts are really
Yeah.
good for Terran now, but that's especially I want to talk about Wings of Liberty. In Wings of Liberty and Heart of the Swarm and various points of Legacy, the Broodlord was so strong that you had to shift your focus into air units in order to compete, and it shifts the game into kind of an air versus air battle state that is very uninteresting. Another problem with the Broodlord, in my opinion, is that it it is much better when you mass them. It is like the perfect death ball unit. If you have just one Broodlord, the Broodlord itself actually does not do that much damage, but the strength of the Broodlord is tripping the pathing of ground units,
Yes.
and that's what makes the Broodlord so strong. But if you just have one Broodlord, it actually doesn't do a lot with tripping up that pathing, but you're encouraged to have 10 Broodlords. The more Broodlords you get, essentially, the better it is. And that kind of degenerates into kind of death ball gameplay that we want to try to avoid. So that's the Broodlord. With the Infestor, I think the real problem with the Infestor is that it allows you to subvert the supply cap in some ways.
Yes.
In that every Infestor can make 8 infested Terrans, and 8 infested Terrans is like, if we're being conservative, it's like 4 supply of units, right?
Mm.
And if we're not being conservative, you could say that an infested Terran is like close to the level of a Marine and it's 8 supply. But essentially, that allows you to like create an army that is much more powerful than you should have at any given point. So as a thought experiment, imagine if like the Infestor only had 100 max energy, right? And it could only summon at max 4 infested Terrans at the same time, or summoning infested Terrans had a cooldown. And I think in that situation, the summoning of quote unquote free units would be a lot more digestible there. With regards to Swarm Host, I think Swarm Host also has 2 problems. The first problem is that I think summoning locusts is not very punishable at all.
Mm.
Yes, you summon these locusts, but you can summon them from so far away
Yes.
that it's really hard to interact with the swarm host itself, and you can often get into a helpless situation. The second problem is that with the current design of the swarm host, it really encourages a lot of all-in play. Oftentimes, the best counter to seeing that your opponent is going swarm host is to all-in them right there and then, and it often becomes a very binary situation in which you can either just all-in them now, or you could like wait until you slowly die. I think relative to when swarm hosts were the legacy swarm hosts were first
Yes.
introduced, I think players have gotten a lot better about this. A lot better about learning like, oh, I can still survive the swarm hosts and play a long macro game. But it was certainly an issue that I saw when the legacy swarm hosts first came out.
So,
That's it.
and do you want to add 3 units in Stormgate or not? Maybe.
So again, like I think I won't commit one way to the other, but I think it's more about like analyzing all these different problems, and historically all the problems that we've had with quote unquote free units in the past in StarCraft 2, and trying to avoid the pitfalls rather than trying to avoid free units altogether.
Okay. So you talk a little bit about resources, and at the moment, do you know how many resources do you want in the game? 2 resources, 4 resources, another
Yeah.
number.
Yeah, so we're currently thinking about 2 resources right now, and the resources will be very similar to that of StarCraft in StarCraft, where there is a rate limited resource, and there's a more general resource like minerals, for example, and a rate limited resource like Vespian gas. We think it's really cool that that in StarCraft, for example, you can scout that your opponent has 2 gas, and you can scout that at the 5-minute mark he has 1 Colossus. And as a pro player, I know, oh, you can't have more than that amount of gas in your inventory or in your resource bank, and therefore I know you can't also have a Stargate, or I know you also can't have 2 forges chrono boosting upgrades at the same time. So this allows a degree of skill for players to interact with their opponents, and it's very skill testing for especially our highest level of players. With regards to the primary resource, we're thinking about something closer to that of the StarCraft 1 model, where there is diminishing returns for each subsequent worker that you're on a mineral line. So on one base, the first worker gets 100% efficiency maybe, and the second worker maybe gets 95% efficiency, and the third worker gets 90% efficiency. And what that allows us to do is it accomplishes a few things actually. Number one, it encourages our goal of highlighting the importance of territory control, because it encourages players to expand. With this model, what happens is if you have 10 workers on 2 bases, you're actually mining more income than 10 workers on 1 base. Whereas this is not necessarily true in StarCraft 2. The second benefit this gives us is the ability to mitigate the impact of harassment. In StarCraft 2, if you lose 50% of your workers, you often lose 50% of your income. Whereas with this model, it allows us to say, if you lose 50% of your workers, you actually maybe only lose 30% of your income. We're taking a lot of inspiration also from both the Warcraft 3 and the Age of Empires franchises as well. Again, in Warcraft 3 specifically, I referenced in the past, but we talked a lot about the amount of worker and mining asymmetry that allows us to have very varied harassment. From the Age of Empires franchise, we took a lot of inspiration from the fact that different factions can attain resources in different ways, and they have a lot of different strengths and weaknesses as to how they obtain those resources.
Yes.
So we're taking a lot of inspiration there.
Okay.
I will say, I think Age of Empires, I think, is actually a really cool game and a really cool franchise. As a player myself, I think it's really cool that there are these 4 resources, and you can kind of like micro your macro in some way.
Right.
I do think, however, that number one, we're trying to stick to a Blizzard style RTS, We want to. Our thinking is we're more sticking to like the core two resource model that traditionally Blizzard RTSs have had ever since StarCraft One. The other thing is that in the Age of Empires model, a lot of the attention is focused around resources, around microing that economy,
Yes.
And in order for you to achieve that, you kind of have to less focus on your army, right? So in my mind, Age of Empires is a little bit more about economy management than a Blizzard style RTS, and a little less about the army management compared to a Blizzard RTS. And I think you can have a game where there's a lot of both, but I think it can be overwhelming to players to do so. Imagine having to do that Age of Empires kind of macro in a StarCraft game, right? I can barely manage my economy in StarCraft too, so it can be pretty daunting.
Okay. So in terms of priority for gameplay, what is the most important for you? Competitivity, sorry, or fun?
Yeah, I would say that I think I kind of talked about this before, but like I think fun is definitely when you're designing a game, fun is number one, and the competitivity will come afterwards. That doesn't mean
Okay.
at all that we're not making a competitive game at all, and we're not going to balance the game. But we want to make sure that players are enjoying playing our game, even at the highest level. And like, again, the greatest example of that is let's say the game is perfectly balanced, but players are still not having fun, as with perhaps Investor Broodlord time when maybe the win rates actually were pretty close to 50-50, but a lot of players would tell you, oh, I'm not having fun right now. Right. So our philosophy with balance, as I mentioned before, is really trying to maximize the fun via a variety of tactics.
Okay. And can you give a few examples of new mechanics that you want to include in Stormgate? Some unique
So
things?
yeah, so one of the things I talked about is the idea of respawnable creeps, these kind of mini objectives that
Yeah.
spawn over the map. I want to talk a bit about our team mode here as well. So in the 3v3 team mode, we're going to have a lot of new mechanics that I don't think we've seen, especially in a lot of in Blizzard RTSs, where for the first time ever, I think we're designing a team mode of a Blizzard style RTS from the ground up. And what that means is we're not copying pasting rules from 1v1 as has been traditionally done with almost
Yeah.
every RTS that has ever existed, and we're building unique rules for the 3v3 team battle mode. So things that could happen is like the creeps could drop runes that affect the whole team, right? Or you have like maybe a lot of objectives over the map that you have to fulfill.
Okay.
So we're having a lot of innovation, especially in the 3v3 team battle mode, and it's actually one of the modes I'm most excited about, and the team has been having a lot of fun playing it. So I can't wait to show players what we have in store in that department, especially.
I have a very specific question. Sorry. You talk a lot about 1 versus 1 and 3 versus 3, but do you want to do a 2 versus 2 mode or not?
So with our current plans, we are focused on supporting the 1v1 mode and the 3v3 mode at launch. I don't know exactly what will happen after that, but yes, those are our main focuses right now, to create a 1v1 mode that is fun, and a 3v3 mode that is very fun. I'm sure we're also gonna create a lot of we have a lot of mod maker tools. So for mod makers, I think
Yeah.
it's probably not going to be too difficult to create a 2v2 map and have 4 players spawn into the map.
Okay. So let's go to some, I don't know the word in English, but touchy questions from viewers. Can you talk a little bit about your business model? I saw a lot of questions about this on Twitter, on social media. Do you want to add skins? Will it be pay to win? I don't think, but will it be pay to win? Yeah.
Yeah, so we're not going to be pay to win, first of all, and we are going to have skins. Basically, our business model is going to center a lot around lessons that we learned while we are on the StarCraft 2 team when we transitioned the box product model of StarCraft 2 to a free-to-play model. When we did that, we doubled our player base, and that had very positive, drastic outcomes for our player base. Because of the higher player base, we were able to maybe get like shorter queue times, for example, right? So what does that mean specifically with Stormgate? With Stormgate, what we intend to do is that we're going to create content that is going to try to serve all our individual pillars, all our individual game modes. That includes the PvE cooperative, the campaign modes, the 1v1 PvP mode, and the 3v3 PvP mode. So, for example, we're going to create new skins. We're going to create new cosmetics. We're going to create new campaigns. We're going to create new commanders in PvE co-op, for instance, right? And we're going to allow players to support the game modes that they wish to engage with. If you like campaign content, you will be able to buy more campaign content. If you like competitive content, you will be able to buy alterations or skins, or yeah, alterations or skins or loading profiles, for instance. And you will be able to support the game modes that you like.
Okay. Another questions. I asked this question because many viewers asked it. After watching the trailer, many people says that it seems like you recycle ID from Blizzard games. And what is your feeling about this? So many players said that it looks like StarCraft 2 with Diablo franchise, mix from both of them. So what is your feeling about this?
Yeah. So how we came to our setting is we worked backwards. We thought about the gameplay that we wanted. For example, we wanted airplay, for instance. We wanted like maybe spaceships, or some kind of like higher than airplay, like
Yeah.
cooldowns, for example. And so we tried to really pick a setting that is able to accomplish these goals. And what you have now is, that's how we ended up with our setting, basically. Just as an example, we couldn't do like a realistic setting, right? We couldn't do World War II like you have with the Company of Heroes franchise. I think the Company of Heroes franchise, Company of Heroes is actually my favorite RTS franchise outside of Blizzard games. And I think they do an excellent job of immersing players into the feel of World War II. Specifically, like the sound design, like the chaos of the battlefield, really brings me in. But to be historically accurate, they can't really have like spaceships, right? For
Yes.
example. So that's something. That's something that where we say, oh, this precludes us from having a more realistic setting. So that is how we chose the universe of Stormgate that we are in. One other thing I want to mention is like I think the one cool thing about this universe is we get to explore a lot of a lot of like traditional like universes that I personally nerd out about. Like we have the more sci-fi, we have the more fantasy. There's going to be technology and magic battling out together. So I can't wait to show like players, or like I guess the team can't wait to show players, because I am definitely not writing the lore. You don't want me to do that.
No.
The team is going to show players like how these forces are going to interact with each other, and hopefully the gameplay will reflect a cool battle between that magic and that technology and whatever else we might have later down the road.
Okay. And last question. Do you feel that your game is too ambitious because your studio is still a small studio compared to Blizzard, for example? Yeah, do you feel that your game is ambitious because you want to do the next big RTS?
Yeah, I absolutely feel that our game is extremely ambitious. And to caveat this, we are a relatively small studio. We don't have like the endless amounts of money
Yeah.
that maybe a Blizzard Entertainment or Blizzard Entertainment might have. We raised almost $40 million, and to a lot of people, I think this sounds like a lot of money.
Wow.
But it's still a limited budget. So this means two things. Number one. Um, a lot of our resources are going into development rather than, for instance, marketing, right? So that's a large reason for why I am talking to you right now, right? Um,
Yes.
a lot of a lot of our ways to market the game involve kind of reaching out to grassroots, reaching out to community. We won't have billboards in Times Square, for example. And we really are depending on the community to get the word out there of what Stormgate is about. We really are depending on the community to tell your friends. The second thing I want to say is that because we are, number one, going to be a free to play game, at some point we are going to have to put our pencils down. Like the money is going to run out at some time, and what we release with will definitely not have all the features that StarCraft 2 might have. A game that has been within 10 that has 10 years of development laid onto it post launch, right? Plus however many years that
Mm.
the game was cooking from before launch. So things that we are focusing on with our initial 1.0 release is number one, the gameplay feel of the game, right? We want to make it sure we want to make it so that the game feels really good. It feels really responsive. Everything is really crisp, and the pathfinding is really excellent. I would say that is like our core goal of what we intend to launch with. However, we recognize that the amount of content, the amount of actual content in the game, definitely won't be anywhere close to what a StarCraft 2 has with four fully fledged campaigns, each lasting anywhere between, I guess Nova has 10 missions or 9 missions, but the Wings of Liberty campaign had like 30 plus missions. We're definitely not going to be launching with anywhere close to that amount of content. So, in many ways, we are trying to reduce the scope of what we're trying to bring out.
Yes.
And another example is we're not going to initially support the 2v2 or 4v4 or a free for all mode right there. That's another example of somewhere where we don't have time or we don't want to put our focus in balancing those modes and creating maps for those modes. So yeah, just little things that we're trying to be more scrappy about, and with the promise that yes, our initial gameplay is going to try to be as solid as possible, but we might not have the content that is expected from someone who's been playing a veteran StarCraft 2 player who's been engaging with the game for many years.
Okay. So that's all for my questions, and thanks a lot for all your answer. It was very interesting. Many informations about gameplay. Maybe one day we will do another interview with more content when more informations will be released from First Giant. So if you have one word for the French community, maybe.
I should have prepared something in French. That's my mistake. But yeah, thank you for the French community. The French community has been like one of the most supportive communities
Yeah.
and the most passionate communities that I've ever seen coming from StarCraft 2, with like the Iron Squid tournaments, for example, with the O Gaming organization, and just they were so welcome to two of our employees who visited France earlier this month. So thanks for that as well. But I hope you guys enjoyed what you heard today. And if you want to support us, you can, number one, go to playstormgate.com where you can sign up for both the beta and our public newsletter that we'll send out. We've been sending it out every 2 months in the past. I'm not sure what the cadence will be in the future, but definitely sign up to get constant development updates. Another thing you can do to help us is to go to Steam
and wishlist Stormgate on Steam. By doing so, you increase Stormgate in the Steam algorithm, and you allow Steam to show our game off to more players and reach a wider audience. And then finally, you can tell all your friends to do the same. Sign up on the website, wish list on Steam, and just spread the word about how RTS is such a fun genre, and Stormgate will hopefully be a game that can compete and that can be kind of the next great Blizzard style RTS.
And there is another link, the Reddit, the subreddit for Stormgate. So all links will be in the description of the video. So if you want to check them, yes, just open the description and check them. So thanks a lot, Monk.
Bye.
Bye.